Chief Constable, this looks a bit intimidating.
I'm sure soon to be joined by some pals.
Reinforcements. Yeah, quickly. Okay. Well, welcome to the Public Accountability Board, and welcome to the press and members of the public, as well as ourselves. And this is just to remind you that we are being filmed, and the film may be uploaded onto our website at some point, so if you don't want to be filmed, then please leave the room now. Otherwise, we take it that you are consenting to being filmed by remaining in the room. Looking at the agenda then, item 1, welcome and apologies. Quite a number of people are delayed by there's a crash on the motorway, I think, junction 35, and people have been delayed. I know Sarah Pullman from Barnes is delayed, Melvin is delayed. So we'll await their arrival. Apologies. Have we any other apologies? Julian?
Lauren, I think.
Lauren.
Yeah, Lauren Polton is on leave. I know that Jeff and Tim Fulbrough are joining us shortly.
Filming notification will be done. There are no announcements. Item 3. Public questions, we haven't received any until a late question came in from Wendy Zealand, and I could say we wouldn't take it, but we will take it. I think the Chief will be able to answer. So Wendy, would you like to read your question out and then get the Chief to answer?
Can the Chief Constable explain if he's aware of how many people have signed up for the alert system that are not receiving any information due to the type of equipment they asked to receive by? The system was sold to South Yorkshire trustees as all singing, all dancing, and would reach all and sundry, so Neighbourhood Watch have undertaken to constantly sell it. We're now getting numerous calls to say members are not receiving, and on inquiry from local force members, it's because the force are charged 19p for a landline message and 9p for a text message. So it appears that at the minute discrimination is in place because of the effect it's having on the police force financially.
I don't know whether we know all the answers to that.
Yes, no. Well, if I just try and unpick some of the elements that I can give an answer to, we have, as of today, just in excess of 13,000 people having signed up to SYP Alerts, which is considerably more than we had under the old Confirmer system. We do know that that is a figure that is set to grow exponentially. We've seen a very significant uptake, and if you were to plot the numbers of people signing up on a daily, weekly basis, that is a very steep trajectory, and we intend to continue with that work, because whilst we're very pleased with where we've got to at this stage, it's nowhere near where we want to arrive at. I think in terms of the quality of the feeds, we consistently ask for feedback from people as to the quality of what is being received, and on average, out of the potential sort of 6 stars, if you like, most people responding to the survey will rate the messages and the quality of the messages at 5.5 out of 6. So there is a real appetite for the messaging, and there is, it would seem, an overwhelming majority of people who feel that the messaging is appropriate to their needs. That said, we do know that some of the messaging can be improved. Some of the messaging which is about types of crime and what have you, I think can be leavened by crime prevention advice and what have you. What we don't want to do is just give people necessarily a summary of what's happened. We want to draw the messages out from that. And of course this becomes the principal vehicle for neighbourhood policing to let people know what's happening in their areas. Insofar as the equipment issue is concerned, I'm more than happy to delve in more detail into the substance of the question. Suffice to say, there are 2 forms of information that can be communicated to people. So there is the text variant, and to be honest, I'm not aware of the costings issue having been any sort of blocker to the way that those messagings go out. The idea around the text stuff is that we would only put out on text something which is sort of almost hypercritical. So we have information, for example, of a child having been abducted in an area or something like that. That would be the vehicle around which the text communication would take place. The predominant feed is email traffic. Most of those 13,000, in fact, all of those 13,000 plus messages that go out on a daily basis go out via email, and of course there's no cost in that respect, save the opportunity cost of actually producing the content. So as to the point of discrimination, I'm not entirely sure where that stems from. I am quite happy to take that as a subset of the question and explore it further.
I think that'd be very helpful, yeah, because I'm not sure I can get my head around that. Okay, thank you. Don't think there are any other public questions. Urgent items. I have three, which I did alert you to, I think, on which we'll cover under urgent items. First of all, I think an update on 101, because we've had, as you are aware, we have pressure all the time from particularly elected members, I think, around 101 and where we're at and what's happening. So I think an update there would be very useful if we do them one at a time. So if we take that first.
Okay. Mark, would you mind?
Yeah, Lauren sends her apologies. She's on leave. She would normally pick this up, but she's had a look. I think the starting point is to recognise the context in which us and Together All Forces are in terms of demand. And I'll give some more detail, but to cut to the nub of it, Atlas Court is resourced. In order to further resource Atlas Court at the moment, we'd have to take resource from elsewhere, which could end up with a situation where we staffed up Atlas Court to the detriment of the people who then have to go out and do the jobs. So there is a difficulty around that in terms of the broader resourcing piece. In terms of the volumes on it, last year we received nearly 500,000 calls on the 101 line and 240,000 calls on the 999 line. That equates to 1,318 non-emergency calls every day and 660 emergency calls every day. Those are significant volumes. So that's just for the call handling police. Beyond we actually look at then the officers who have to go out and deal with them.
So some of those will be repeat. There'll be some people are phoning a lot, shall we say?
Yes, and we look at those, we try and triage those, we try and identify our frequent flyers, as it were, and come up with solutions. Some of them are people who have a genuine need that we have to recognise, because repeat calls in their own right can be a sign of vulnerability. So we need to be alive, we need to understand that. But there are people perhaps with issues that perhaps are more on the social services side of the house than the policing one. So we need to try and find solutions for those as well. Because obviously it'd be a last resort to actually remove the service from anyone. That would be something we'd only do for repeat misuse of the 999 call. It's something we're prepared to do, because all the time we're dealing with calls that shouldn't be coming through to us. That means we're giving an inferior service to people who genuinely need us.
Is that because local authority lines are even more difficult to access? I don't know.
You'd have to, there'll be individual cases.
Okay.
We do end up as sometimes we are the service that are here all the time and accessible, and we do try and deal with people's things. So perhaps victims of our own desire for public service at times. It's a difficult one to unpick. I'll come on to it, but people do still ring with absolute rubbish. And it's something I think we'll revisit in the comms plan later in the year. I think the plan is for us to actually use some of the nonsense calls that we get, and people need to realise that while they're making their call for, you know, my pizza's not turned up, well, that might mean that someone who's in actual need of the police doesn't get a service. So there's an education piece, there is something about channel shift, and I think with the new website, and as we look to develop that, gives us opportunities for people to make more of those routine inquiries, and we are going to try and publicise that so we get the genuine demand. But I think there is probably something in the public that they need to recognise the actual demand that the service is on for, and make sure that they are contacting us appropriately.
I think something about educating the public is important, because when I go to meetings and give an illustration that, you know, my pizza's not turned up, people are disbelieving, but then they're responsible people usually in those community type meetings and don't necessarily understand.
And I do think it's absolutely the case that some of these stories are so frankly wacky, for want of a better idea, that people think they're somehow apocryphal. But when you listen, as I have, to somebody who dialed 999 recently to report the discovery of an unusual slug in her garden, you do realise that some people are completely off beam in terms of what it is that we're trying to deal with. This is not an argument to say that, it's not an argument to say that all our calls, of course, of that character. Many calls are really important, and we want to deal with them as soon as we possibly can. But what we are pointing to is that there's a lot of clutterance in the system that certainly doesn't help. And if we could take that clutterance out, then we at least have a better chance to deal with the core. And that, I think, as the DEP is currently highlighting, is the predominant feature of the review that's ongoing.
Is there something in the public mind about 101 being a general service? They're not relating it specifically to policing and policing type criminal issues.
Don't think so.
I mean, wayward slugs, it's very hard to see.
I think where we find things where there is absolutely a crossover, and to be fair, one can't be overly critical of the public not necessarily being able to distinguish, because one person's litter is another person's antisocial behaviour, and we understand that. But actually we get a tremendous number of calls about non-hate crime related graffiti, litter, fly tipping, noise nuisance, all things which are core local authority responsibilities, and in respect of which we have limited powers. That is absolutely not to say that if we come across somebody who is emptying a transit van of building materials into a lay-by, that we wouldn't do something about. Of course we would, and we understand that this is a very annoying thing. It annoys all sensible people. But actually there's a great swathe of call which has some tangential link to antisocial behaviour, and that similarly provides a massive slug of demand. And so when we talk about channel shifting, we're absolutely not talking about developing organisationally slopey shoulders to just dump work into other categories, but actually there's something about more rationally being able to say to people, if this is the issue, don't hang about in the 101 queue for 20 minutes to be disappointed. That's your point of call. That's where your issue can be addressed. And Mark's point about the website is a good one in that regard, because we do increasingly want to be able to use that as the vehicle to signpost people to the appropriate services. Some of our frustration about implementation around smart contact is that part of the feature of smart contact will be to assist in queue busting by giving verbal sort of catalyst to signpost people within that queue. And the other big thing is being able to say, even if it is actually a legitimate policing issue, but it's very localised and it's a cause of recurrent antisocial behaviour in a given locality, a park or whatever, signposting people directly to the neighbourhood policing teams for whom we have now established communication lines. So we're trying to make the demand more diffuse and handle it more sensibly. Because we have to do all of those things self-evidently, but in the final analysis, the only way to really shorten these timescales is to pump a huge amount of additional investment into the system. And I would argue that there is a public debate to be had as to whether that is entirely sensible given the many, many other pressures that we face as well.
Okay. Mark, we're interrupted.
No. Advice is available on our website, southyorkshire.police.uk. Contact us, should I call 101? It's the, hope that's not a 101 call.
Yes, exactly. It's not.
Now ringing the ACC's direct on the mobiles as an efficiency measure. One of the pleasing things, I think, is that despite the high volume of calls coming into the call centre and the pressurised nature of those calls, we're getting good feedback from HMIC, who are praising the standard of the call taking, the thoroughness, professionalism, and I think as well the compassion that our staff genuinely shows to the public when there is an issue. which is really good considering the pressure that's on our people. They asked to retain that public service ethos, which really marks us out as something different from a traditional call centre, because it's rather more high consequence than ordering a fridge, and people need a good deal more empathy. There's some specifics that I can provide you in terms of the particular call days when we've had delays. Delays on the 101 are not something we would wish, but that's because we prioritise 999, which I think is entirely the right thing to do.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. I think because of where we're at with the replacement IT system, it's something we'll keep on the agenda for future PABs and have some sort of feedback briefly a week, you know, as we have each of the PAB meetings. Thank you very much.
And may I, just as a quick caveat, just to emphasise the point that when we say that we would wish to prioritise 999s, we have, despite the very significant increase in 999s, and we think over the last reporting period alone we've seen another 9% increase in 999s, that actually we have maintained our performance around 999s. That does come at the expense of 101. But I would hope the public would understand that if you have 999s and 101s and you can't service both, then you have to prioritise 999s, which we've done successfully, and the people have worked very hard to be able to achieve that, and that's still a good news story and good performance.
Okay, thank you. We're still on urgent items. The second one arose from a number of articles that appeared in the Times in August 22nd, about bail orders and whether victims of crime are being put at risk as police abandoned. This was the argument in the articles, bail orders. So I wondered if you could say something about what the changes have been and why, what are the risks, what's happened in South Yorkshire, and that you're satisfied that no one in South Yorkshire has been put at risk as a result of these changes, if there have been changes here.
Okay. I'll talk to that. Tim. So these changes came about in April of 2017 as a result to changes to provisions surrounding police bail brought in by the government. You'll recall in the period leading up to that, there was considerable public concern raised, and principally it was around some high-profile cases. Paul Gambacini's case being one, where he was on police bail for the best part of a year once an investigation took place. And all these changes relate to not what happens when someone's charged, it's about what happens during the course of the investigation. So prior to April 17, if someone was arrested, brought into custody, it was interviewed and had to be released for further inquiries to take place, and then to get them back to a police station to perhaps re-interview them or charge them. They'd be released on either conditional or unconditional bail. That would be granted on authority of the custody sergeant. So if you were brought in for shoplifting and further statements had to be obtained, or CCTV, or further inquiries had to be undertaken, and there was no risk to the public, there was no risk of further offending, you'd be released on unconditional bail to come back to the police station at a defined point in the future. If there is a risk to the public, or under various other specified criteria, the custody sergeants have the power to impose certain conditions. That could be a condition of residence at a particular address, a range of different conditions. That changed, and principally the change is related to the removal of the power of unconditional bail in April 17. If I deal first of all with conditional bail now can only be granted on authority of an inspector where there are certain grounds present that require the protection of the public, and the inspector can only grant conditional bail for a period of 28 days. After 28 days, that can be extended by a superintendent for a period of up to 3 months, 6 months in exceptional circumstances, but 3 months. And then, after 3 months, if it still necessary to keep that individual on bail, there's a requirement to go to court to seek the court's authority to extend that period of bail. As I said, that relates principally to cases where there are safeguarding concerns, where it's necessary to safeguard individuals or safeguard the public. That only forms a relatively small part of the total volume of offenders. So where people would have been released on unconditional bail in the past to come back to a specific date, to come back to the police station on a specific date, they're now released under investigation. The acronym that's used frequently throughout the service is RUI. And you'll see that in the paper now. People are released under investigation. In many ways, it's the same as unconditional bail, albeit it doesn't there's no obligation on that individual to present themselves at a police station on a particular date. So that's the situation. We ran a goal group prior to the implementation of that. It wasn't without its teething issues when it was implemented, but we now have a system in place where that we operate within the new guidelines within the custody suite. In terms of the risks that it threw up, I suppose the first one was about when officers had prisoners on bail. One of our early reviews, we noticed that there was a proportion of people who were initially released on bail for a period of 28 days and subject to conditions, but when it got to 28 days, that was then changed to being released under investigation. So that can be for one of two reasons. It can be one, that the conditions that were necessary to protect the public have diminished and it's no longer necessary to keep them on conditional bail, or it could be that they don't want to go and see a superintendent and go through the bureaucracy of seeking an extension to that bail. We reviewed that. We didn't find any real evidence of that, the odd isolated case, but what we changed in terms of our internal procedures was that where someone wants to change a suspect from being on bail to being an RUA after 28 days, that needs to be reviewed by a superintendent anyway. So we're confident now that we have tight procedures around that. The other risk is that people are using RUI instead of conditional bail, and it's particularly of concern that in the case of cases of domestic abuse, well, all cases relating to domestic abuse are reviewed daily at force DMMs to pick up issues around that. And the third risk is that you will have heard me talk, certainly within the environment of the Crime Standards Board in the past, about crime management, about keeping control of the number of outstanding offenders that you've got on police bail, who's outstanding for different offences, how do you maintain a level of grip around the volume of reactive investigations. There's no getting away from it that the system as it existed prior to April 2017 did afford some element of performance management around that, because if you bailed a subject on conditional bail for 3 weeks to take 3 statements, there became an operational imperative to get that done within 3 weeks. There's the potential, because those dates don't exist now, for that to slip. And when we're in an environment where there's ever increasing demands from calls to service, that remains a continuing risk. But that's monitored through performance management, both locally and at a force level, in terms of looking at the numbers of suspects that are outstanding for offences, the number of outstanding offenders, the volume of open crime that's existing on all districts. And we've not, whilst that continues to be an issue for us in terms of demand, what we've not seen is an explosion of that, such as that we don't have any control over it anymore. So, in summary, and I have to say I haven't been aware, I've not read the articles in the Times that you refer to.
Okay.
So I'm not sure about what specific issues were raised in those articles.
Well, I think we understand it. We get what you're saying. I think the issue in the Times articles is concerning people who previously might have been released on conditional bail and now not on conditional, and who present a risk to somebody has safeguarding issues and domestic abuse you mentioned. I think I need to be satisfied that as far as SYP are concerned, we're not putting people at risk because of these changes in bail arrangements.
We need to be clear though, we work within the legal framework we are given. And I think at the time the Bail Act reforms were being considered, the service did make representations to highlight what we perceive as the issues, and it's obviously an entirely proper function of the state that the government takes cognizant of those and then brings out law and balances the other requirements. And as Tim says, there was
so was it SYP's view that this was a mistake, or
well,
this was...
Well, I think the service made representations about the potential risks that the changes could make, and I think some of those are continuing to give us some concern, and that's about the statutory framework that we work with. In very much the same way, when there were certain decisions taken nationally about the use of stop and search, it's not for us to question the law that's in. We work within the legal framework, we'll make our views clear in the run-up to any new legislation, and it's a matter for government whether they carry sway or not. So I think the system that we now work in, no doubt, could be seen to meet some of the objectives that were sought by the new Act. As Tim's articulated, it does present operational challenges that previously wouldn't have been the case under the Bail Act, but we will work within them. I think we are acutely aware of the potential risk that people who are under investigation or deemed suspects in cases can present to the public, and we will at a given point bring forward and brief you on some really good work that's been done in Sheffield around assessing the potential threat posed by suspects, because we want to make sure that those suspects we are targeting to bring to justice at the earliest possible opportunity and seek their arrests are the right suspects, because we'd like to lock them all up tomorrow, but frankly we'd rather lock up a high-risk domestic abuse perpetrator than a shoplifter. So we've done some really good work at Sheffield, which is now being promulgated around the districts, to make sure that districts are properly focused on those people under investigation who could cause our communities harm. So we are alive to it, putting something in place. I think the work that's been done in Sheffield and now rolled out probably puts us in advance of most forces in the country, if not all. And we'll bring that forward, hopefully, to give you some reassurance that it's an issue that we're alive to.
But I think just to provide you some reassurance around, what happens in the custody suite, all the custody sergeants are properly briefed about, the judicious use of bail. That's reviewed on a daily basis in terms of the prisons that are going through the custody suite.
And I think that's the nub of the issue. I think at this stage, we haven't identified vulnerability emerging because we're seeking to manage it. But there's little doubt that the changes to the legislation have made it more difficult to manage in this space. And I think that in some respects, the impetus should have been on reducing the time upon which people were held on bail, rather than changing the whole of the Bail Act. So I think there is something about a sledgehammer to crack a nut here, and I think we live with the consequences. We're managing the consequences such that we don't perceive that we have people directly at risk, but frankly, elements of the new Bail Act which have removed what has, I think, been a really strong feature of the previous legislation, which allowed custody sergeants quite sensibly, for example, in the case of somebody who's been arrested for domestic abuse, in the pre-charge investigative period, to impose curfews, to impose restrictions on the perpetrator approaching the victim, to steer clear of the victim and the victim's children, for example. I think those are entirely sensible provisions which we can still access, but there is now an entire bureaucracy that has been invented to surround those sensible decisions that we used to be able to make and did make on hundreds and thousands of times every year. So the new Bail Act, if you like, is one that clearly, like every piece of legislation, we adhere to, and it's not for us to sit and question it. However, it is less helpful.
Well, that's very helpful, and I think probably we will come back to it then and see how things have developed. But while you were away, there were those issues in the newspapers about those changes. Okay. Did anybody else want to take up one? No, so thank you very much. That was urgent items. We're not getting very far, are we? So, Item 6, nothing there, I think. Item 7, declarations of interest. Don't think there are any other additional. Item 8, minutes of the last meeting. That's pages 1 to 12. In terms of the accuracy of the minutes, are they a true and correct record? Thank you very much. Shall we look at matters arising in actions then, which is 13 and 14? Michelle, are you taking it?
Yes, I can take these, Commissioner. But the first one that hasn't been discharged, 332.
Yeah.
It's all right. I was just looking at the first two. They're ongoing anyway. 332. Just a little bit of explanation, because ACC Forber here is here, and the proposal is to transfer that to ACC Forber. This arose out of Stuart Bartley's report, District Commander in Sheffield, around sanctions used by courts in respect to low-level offences, particularly homelessness, where those that were homeless were given fines without the ability to pay for them, and he said he was going to raise it at the local criminal justice board. Well, it's ACC Forber that sits on the LCJB, and we've got a meeting coming up, so I presume that will be...
So welcome back, we just added to your agenda.
Sorry, Tim. Next one, 335, was a question you asked of the force in relation to understanding their internal governance and where decisions were made and the flow of decision making through the various meetings that appeared in a report. I think ACC Courtney was doing that, Chief.
She was.
I've actually got a work in progress version which I can send you after this meeting, but it is still work in progress.
Okay, just on that, can I just extend my apologies? We did undertake to do this 2 meetings ago, so the work in progress element doesn't particularly music to my ears. It needs to be done, and we'll have that done within the week, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Chief. And then 338, this can be completed and discharged. That was the one around the quarterly overview of performance action outcomes.
Okay. So that's everything on the actions page, I think, unless anyone has a question. Thank you very much. Item 11 then, budget monitoring report. Michael, this is you, pages 21 to 27.
Item 10.
Oh, I'm sorry, the work programme. I missed the work programme. Erica, is there anything on the work programme? 15 to 20.
Just to say that the work programme comes here for the next 3 months at every meeting and has now been updated to reflect the planning timetable that we agreed at Planning and Efficiency Group earlier this year. So now each month you'll get a little bit more detail on where we're at with the planning timetable. I'll not talk about the outcomes of the Planning and Efficiency Group until we get to item 14, Commissioner.
Okay, thank you. So, item 11 then, the budget monitoring report. This follows the external auditor's conclusions.
Yes, thank you, Alan. So this report is an addendum to the report that came to June's PAB meeting. It relates to the financial outcome position, the final accounts effectively, for the previous financial year, which ended on the 31st of March 2018. In June, we reported on the draft position for that financial year end, which was a £6 million revenue underspend, leaving in balances £38.9 million. Subsequently, we've had a reserve strategy which accounts for the use of those reserves over the next 45 years. Well, I won't get into that detail now, you'll be pleased to hear. You touched on the auditors, so in June and into the month of July, we've been in discussion with the external auditors as they've gone through the accounts of the PCC, the PCC's office and the forces budgets regarding the treatment of a couple of legacy issues, which in the draft accounts we'd treated as a contingent liability, and I won't get into too much of a technical accounting differentiations, but effectively we were noting their potential future costs. We didn't feel we had sufficient information at that point in time to quantify it with certainty at the 31st of March 2018 to include a financial value in the accounts of that financial year end. During discussion in the audit with KPMG, our external auditors, we've agreed with them that we would actually set aside some financial values, 2 provisions totaling £1.6 million relating to those legacy issues. The first one is around £500,000 relating to some historic CSC civil claims for compensation relating to those which we may need to pay in the future.
and the second is £1.1 million over a Hillsborough-related cost which we may need to pay into the future. But the combined value of those is £1.6 million, and we're effectively provided with those costs in advance out of the 31st of March 2018. Now providing for an estimate of those potential costs for accounting purposes, and that serves to reduce the previously reported underspend on the bottom line from being £6 million to £4.4 million, and correspondingly reduces the reserves down to £37.3 million. These are not new financial pressures as such, in that we had some broad estimates of those costs built into the current year budget and the medium-term resource strategy, so this is much a sort of timing issue in terms of recognition of those values in the accounts. So.
Okay, thank you very much. I thought I knew what the difference between a contingent liability and a provision was until I asked Nigel about it, and then I was thrown into total confusion. So. You referred me to SYP, I think. So. Okay, any questions or reservations on those? Thank you very much. On then to the police and crime plan delivery, and item 12, the force performance report, and we're doing this district by district, and this is the second time we've had Barnsley come before us. Sarah, I think you are now Barnsley embodied or personified.
Absolutely.
Rather than
I'm not sure I'm disagreeing with all of that.
Okay. So if you want to just highlight, we assume we've read the report, and just highlight one or two things for us.
So just going, obviously the section 3 onwards talks about performance, so crime performance, and since probably October, November last year, we've really concerted effort around serious acquisitive crime, primarily burglary, robbery, and other kind of auto crime offences. We had an Operation Moscow, which was a proactive operation which we've been running since that time, which is focusing all of our assets around the key hotspots, the peak times following temporal analysis. And I think it's fair to say that we've sustained reduction from November onwards, with a bit of a spike in March, which was due to a couple of nominals coming out of prison and committing quite a number of burglary offences, which is why you've seen that spike there. So in summary, really positive results for us across burglary, both business and residential, robbery, both personal and business, and then in the final graph, which the table on page 3 it will be, which it just gives you that kind of month by month analysis over each of those crime types, showing improvements pretty much across the board. So we're obviously continuing that effort around Operation Moscow. We now have an enhanced CID following the implementation of the crime review, so we have more assets within our local CID who are obviously there to deal with serious crime and protecting vulnerable people, but it also gives us greater resilience if we have a crime series appearing and emerging, to focus efforts around that in conjunction with our intelligence team. So I then move on 3.3 to the confidence measures. This is based on Your Voice Counts data. As you can see, it's up until the last financial year, the comparisons. As you can see, we've remained relatively static over that year's period. We did have an improvement in quarter 4, up 1%. It's not massive, but it's showing hopefully signs of the right direction for us. And what you see when you break down the Your Voice Counts data is that we have a discrepancy in confidence measures between the east and west in Barnsley. So your west is the more affluent area of Barnsley, and the east being the areas of Brimethorpe, Goldthorpe, Thurnscoe, all of those sort of areas into the Dearne Valley, where I think it's fair to say there are greater challenges around socioeconomic deprivation, higher levels of crime and ASB, and you can see our confidence drops in that area. So the confidence plan that I wrote last September has been refreshed in conjunction with the force template every quarter, so we keep an eye on our confidence measures every quarter, and we've been focusing our efforts in the east for the last quarter or so, where I've identified that discrepancy. We've completed all of our engagement plans, and obviously the whole objective of those engagement plans is to improve that confidence measure. So unless there's any questions so far, I'll move on. Moving on then to victim satisfaction, 3.4. this is all part of the complete victim care emphasis for the force since last year. We were sitting in the low 70s this time last year for victim satisfaction. And as I've noted in this report, in the last quarter we're up to 89%, so a vast improvement. It did dip slightly in July, as the DEP well knows, so we're figuring out why that's taken place, and we analyse the completely satisfied and the completely dissatisfied victims on a month-by-month basis, so we can get a feeling for what's happening contemporaneously, really, so that we can actually put something in place to rectify any issues that emerge. But we're happy with that Q1 performance. We just now need to achieve some sustainability and get it to stay in the 80s, and I would be really proud of that. One really good achievement, what was pulling us down into the 70s before, was primarily around follow-up police actions, and we're now up into the 80s around both of those aspects. And follow-up is critical because that's what complete victim care is all about. So I'm really pleased with the results we've achieved. Just need to keep an eye on the last month's data and figure that one out. So moving on then to neighbourhood policing, as you know, we were the first district really to go live with the reinvigoration of neighbourhood policing in January 2017. We have extremely strong partnership relations with BMBC, Barnsley Metropolitan Borough Council, and they are 100% the partner with us on the Safer Neighbourhood Service. The Hub, which is our central unit focusing on the complex and vulnerable needs, has yielded such good results for us in terms of dealing with repeat vulnerability, repeat callers, issues such as Barnsley District General Hospital, which not only is a vulnerable location, but also causes us high levels of demand in terms of calls and service. So they've really been extremely effective, and that's been enhanced in the last quarter through mental health workers, 2 mental health workers coming to work with us in the Hub, which again, when you're talking about vulnerable, complex needs individuals, mental health often features, so having them on board is really, really helpful. I guess the biggest change since we last came to see you is that we've created an additional neighbourhood team. So this is part of Mr. Green and my plan around progressing with neighbourhood policing, investing more in neighbourhood policing. We've created a 5th neighbourhood team in Cudworth, and the rationale for this was we had a large area in the north under the base of Royston. It constituted far higher demand than any other neighbourhood district in the district. So what we did, we divvied it up, put some more additional staffing in to create the Cudworth team. They went live on the 6th of August, so obviously early days in terms of the impact there, but hopefully it will enable us to tackle some of those issues around Grimethorpe. It's one of the areas in the east, more effectively to push up our confidence and tackle some of the crime and ASB in that area. Moving on then to 4.4. It gives you analysis of ASB data and does show, I think, quite comprehensively the impact that our neighbourhood teams are having around ASB. If you compare quarter 4 last year with quarter 4 this year, we've had a reduction of 765 reported incidents of ASB. And then quarter 1, so the bottom line of the second table, quarter 1 total ASB, again, a reduction of 593 incidents in quarter 1 of this year. So really strong results around the ASB, and I think that's linked in not only to the locality teams in the SNS, but also the Hub dealing with those repeat callers. And what I've been very conscious of is that we aren't displacing this demand. For example, in other areas I've worked, we've found if police stats go down, the council stats go up. So what we've been doing is overlapping the statistics between BMBC and ourselves to make sure that we're not missing anything. But actually what we're seeing across both BMBC and SYP is that demand is coming down. Unless there are any questions, I'll move on to community issues.
It's going to be it.
Yes, of course, yeah. Rural policing, obviously over to the west, Penistone, huge area of rural area over that way. Higher measures of confidence. And one of my chief inspectors leads for rural policing across the force. So we've done specific Op Duxford on rural policing in that area. We've been going out and engaging with every single farmer to collate their views, get them to sign up to SYP Alerts, looking at an SYP Alerts bespoke group for farmers, the rural community, so we're updating them on what we're doing and the good results. And actually we have seen an increase over in the west, so I think that's partly attributable to that. As you will all be aware, we had a period in May where we had 3 homicides within 10 to 14 days, which was unprecedented in Barnsley, to be frank. 3 very distinct homicides, all of which have resulted in charges and pending trials, which is obviously good news for us. But it clearly has an impact on the community. Isolated communities in terms of the locations, and it doesn't seem to have caused too much long-term concern by communities, but clearly impacted for the first few weeks while everyone comes to terms with it. But we aren't seeing any further tensions as a result of that. Obviously we'll continue to monitor as we approach the trials for those tragic incidents. So finally on to engagement and then new structures. I think this is quite business as usual for our neighbourhood teams now around levels of engagement. It doesn't go into detail about SYP Alerts, Facebook and Twitter. We acknowledge that our presence on Facebook and Twitter around the locality teams isn't that great, but what we're getting all of our staff, there's been quite a churn in our staff, so we're getting them all trained so that we can better engage through those mechanisms to ensure that everybody in our community knows what we're up to. Neighbourhood Watch, we relaunched Neighbourhood Watch in June in the Town Hall, which was a really successful event, and that was all at the instigation of our Neighbourhood Watch coordinator and one of my PCs, and we've seen some uplift in the response to Neighbourhood Watch since that time, so I'm hopeful again that will yield dividends in terms of intelligence from our communities. And then finally, so on to the criminal investigations, you're all aware that we went live. Doncaster and ourselves were the first to go live with the crime review implementation. I think it, from my perspective, and certainly from the staff's perspective, it went really well. They are glad to be back, locally owned. They can focus on the issues that concern our community, specifically in Barnsley, so it's much more locally focused, which assists me in terms of managing that risk locally, but also around that victim contact, victim satisfaction, and thereby community confidence. So from my perspective, a really positive move. There were a couple of teething issues, but nothing major. The biggest concern is around PVP staffing, which has been noted in this report, but we've mitigated that through some team and labelling between our resourcing on district to assist PVP through a difficult period. And it's a one-team ethos in Barnsley. We all get involved if we all need to. So that's what we've been doing, and it's really good to have everyone back in the district. So that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for the report. It's I mean, a lot of very good and positive things in the report. The cynic in me slightly wondered whether there were things that might have been in the report which were not so good, which weren't in the report, but I leave that hanging in the air. I mean, I think...
If they are, find out the first performance of the course.
Well, I think what we're saying to all the district commanders is treat this in a sense like force management statements, that we want to know, you know, we do want to know the good things and what's positive and what's happening, but also we do need to know if there are issues around that are troubling and bothering, and we'll draw appropriate conclusions from that. But it's a good report, and we thank you for that. I only had 2 questions having read it, but one of them you've answered, because I found your commentary on the commentary very illuminating, what you said this morning, very illuminating. I'm sorry some of that in a sense wasn't in there, particularly around partnerships, because I think you're right about Barnsley. It was the first into the new operating model, and the closeness, the involvement between the police and the district authority is very important in Barnsley. It should be important across the piece, but it's particularly so in Barnsley, and there has been that good relationship, and that's obviously continued. So I think next time something around partnerships and how that, you know, how that's working out would be really very good. I think the other area I was surprised that you didn't comment on, that was why I was slightly wondering whether the things that should have been in that weren't in, was issues around the town centre, because I know that whenever I go to meetings in Barnsley, someone sooner or later, even if they're not actually in the town itself, they're going to raise questions about the town centre and use of drugs and people falling over in the town and so on. So I just wonder if you could just say a little bit around that.
Of course, the issue of spice, which is an issue in every town centre, every city centre, nationwide now, unfortunately, I believe. It has caused a lot of concern for members of the public, MPs, and obviously BMBC. We, as the police, we've been quite innovative in the way we're trying to deal with these individuals. We've used antisocial behaviour legislation to try, take them out of the town centre, but that only displaces it, so it's not the solution, but it does prevent people being caused distress by seeing people on the street. We're engaging with public health around that longer term, more holistic view of how do we assist people in not taking spice, and actually spice in conjunction with alcohol and other Class A drugs, which does cause even greater concern. And then also we're looking currently and working with the CPS on whether we can use the law around, the legislation around public nuisance. Now, CPS are still considering this, and it's a difficult area to go down because we'd be setting a precedent for every other town centre in the country if we do succeed in getting a charge of public nuisance. So we're still liaising closely with CPS to try and find a way of tackling this issue. I guess the only concern with that is that this is not just a criminal justice issue. This is fundamentally a societal issue, which has changed, and people are much more aware of the use of spice within town centres than they would have been of, say, heroin or crack cocaine. Because when you take heroin or crack cocaine, you tend to do that in private, behind closed doors, so it's just not as visible. And there's been this big shift towards spice, which has a huge impact on the individual for a very short time period, I guess are likened to the impact of heroin in terms of escapism, because they tend to be people who...
Sarah? The district have done an awful lot of work in terms of enforcement. You mentioned your civil injunctions.
Yeah.
And as you say, you are working with CPS to try and find appropriate CJ outcomes, but we're not going to arrest our way out of this.
No.
But there's certainly no lack of effort you've explored. No. You want to mention the injunctions that you've... Yeah,
the civil injunctions, where we obviously have a PSPO, so we've used that to maximum effect. There's 20, in addition to breaches of PSPO, we've had over 20 civil injunctions against individuals within the town centre, which has resolved some of the issue. And then obviously looking at the law around public nuisance. But as I said, and as the DEP says, that's not the way to solve this. What we need is a much more holistic approach across all partners to tackle some of the more fundamental issues, which we are engaging heavily with public health, with mental health, with our drugs and alcohol service in Barnsley.
I get all that, and when I go to public meetings, that's what I try to say. But we do need to hear that SYP have done the maximum in a sense that they can, which is what you're saying.
We're looking at the legal position, because at the moment there's no exact fit for the law. So obviously we're looking what is open to us whilst remaining lawful. But in effect, we've had, and I know we've seen the pictures of people in a collapsed state. The police will come on it. People are rightly concerned if you're passing it with your children, etc. But once we find someone in a collapsed state, unless we actually catch someone putting something in their mouths and can drag it out of their hands and show it's a controlled substance, we're then often, as almost pseudo-medical, trying to work out what we do with these zombified people on the floor. And I fully appreciate it's upsetting for the public, but that's why we're exploring public nuisance, because actually being in a comatose state on the floor as a result of an illicit substance isn't actually strictly a criminal offence, and we're looking at the impact that we can use. So similar to the point at Sheffield, where we discussed the begging and homelessness issue, where the officers and the neighbourhood team have gone through this whole rigmarole of community protection notice, looking at any other sort of measure, a really gradual escalation, signposting all the way to all the supporters there. We eventually get them to court for prosecution, and the court finds them. So we are actively trying to do this, but again, it comes back to this point. We can only work within the frame that we've got. We're trying to do it mindful of the well-being of the individuals who are frankly killing themselves with this stuff, and also cognizant of the impact
finding
on the public.
them is the most to find them is the most ineffective of punishment.
Absolutely. I guess one last thing around our plan around SPICE. We have a POP plan, so a problem-orientated policing plan around SPICE, which embodies and records all the actions that we're taking around SPICE in the town centre. One, because of our close relationships with BNBC, we've also been working in conjunction with them. And one of the key issues for the town centre is a place by the name of Holden House, which tends to be a place, it's a 40-bed unit. It's right in the town centre, and they place all the individuals with multiple needs within that location. It's been recognised for some time. It's a hotspot area for RASB. It's a hotspot for the ambulance service, for pretty much every emergency service. So working with BNBC, they have now decommissioned that service. They're shutting down Holden House in that capacity. Which has started, and what they're doing is migrating the vulnerable people from within into far smaller placements, so houses of 4 beds rather than 40, which I think is, obviously we've been involved in the conversations about it and pushing for that. The locations won't be right in the middle of the town centre. Again, this doesn't solve the problem, but what it does allow is some time and space away from what is quite a toxic environment for individuals to access the services they need. And BNBC are working with Humankind, who focus on supporting vulnerable people to find these alternative locations. So I'm really hopeful by the end of the calendar year, Holden House will be decommissioned entirely. All of the vulnerable people will be placed elsewhere in these smaller units, which are far more compatible with their needs. So I'm hopeful that we'll see a gradual reduction on all of those issues within the town centre as a result of all of the issues, all of the things that we're trying to do within the town centre.
Thank you very much.
Just a point of clarity, because Superintendent Pullman mentioned PSPO, just a member of the Public Space Protection Order. I heard some queries over there. Sorry.
Just the only other comment I got, and if you could just a very brief reply to that, is the question of children's homes, because we know there you mentioned the hospital and the demand that puts on the force and how you're tackling with that, but children's homes, of which seems to be a disproportionate number in the Barnsley district, private children's homes. Yeah. And they also create demand for the force. Could you just say a very brief word around how? Yeah.
We have single points of contact from within our hub that work with each of the more challenging children's homes, and what they do is work with the children's homes on a day-by-day basis to ensure that they're aware of their responsibilities primarily as parents to these children. And actually we've seen some really good results from that in terms of they don't just report the child missing immediately, don't pick up the phone to the police, they actually make a bit of an effort to find the child themselves. And often our most frequent missing people tend to be 17 who unfortunately, due to vulnerability and their lifestyle, they're on the cusp between criminality and missing, so that tends to be our greatest demand right now. And there's only so much I think that a children's home can do around a 17-year-old boy that wants to go out in the evening. So there are some challenges around what we expect them to do, what they can realistically do, and actually what a 17-year-old lad wants to do. But no, we have single points of contact. We've seen reductions across most of the children's homes, although they do tend to fluctuate in terms of calls to service, dependent on the children that are placed within that establishment, because dependent on who's there will increase the demands to us.
Okay, thank you very much. Anybody else any questions? Or
just in terms of the implementation of the crime review and any post-implementation review around victim contact and quality of investigations, etc., what would be a good time for the Commissioner to ask questions about what your findings are as a result of the implementation? 6 months, 9 months?
I think I'm looking at Mr. Ford because he chairs the Crime Review Board, which is overseeing this on a month-by-month basis from a force perspective.
It's not a Barnes question, that's a Falls question.
Yes.
I think probably 9 months, then we'll have been in a year.
Do you have a bulletin that goes out to elected members in Barnsley, as they do in other parts?
We have our neighbourhood newsletter that goes out to the councillors.
Lovely, thank you. Well, thank you very much indeed. That was a good report, and we hope you'll come again. Thank you. Item 12, that was, wasn't it? Item 13, forced performance update. Mark, this is you, pages 31 to 38.
Absolutely. Commissioners, we can see the challenge around safer communities centres upon problem solving, early intervention, prioritisation within our victim-led service, and all of this really underpinned by how well do we understand our demand and how well do we access and implement best practice. I'm pleased to say we can report positively within all of those elements, and in some areas may even be so bold as to say we're perhaps entering in the realms of being national leads around how we're understanding our business and being able to focus really and prioritise to get the very best from our resources in terms of serving our communities and keeping them safe. So I'll just pick the highlights out of this report, assuming it is being read. As we can see, the investment in terms of problem solving, we invested at the turn of the year in 650 of our staff, along with core safe neighbourhood service partners being trained in problem solving. So we've got now a joint language, a joint mindset and a joint approach around that early intervention. That culminates, we've had the first annual award, and that was going to drive the culture, so we embed this even further. As it stands, we've currently got 99 POP plans, so that's problem-oriented plans around early intervention, and these are not just owned by us, these are owned by partners. Some of the challenges there, which we may see a solution from Connect, is we're transferring all of our POP plans now from our portal, which only our staff could access, onto Connect, and we're looking at opportunities there for partners to have lifetime access and join us on Connect, so we are truly jointly managing these action plans without having to share data manually. So we've now got the ability through training and really giving our staff the knowledge. What we can now do is give the focus of where that effort ought to be in terms of problem solving. So in terms of how do we understand our demand, on a quarterly basis now I get a view for each of the districts, which they get populated and refreshed every month, around, in terms of two dimensions, where within each of the districts is the highest demand, and if we're looking whether it's retail, fast food, care homes, we can break that down so we can see how many times we've been called. Where we're beginning to lead the way is we've now got a third dimensional view that sits behind that, a separate view, which also then gives us insight into and how many officer hours are being committed to these areas, so we can see how many times we've been called, but then we can also see in terms of high demand locations. A particular area like the hospital might call us fewer times, but actually officers spend significantly more time there because of the complexity and vulnerability that they face. So we can see the number of hours, which allows us now to look at our top 10, our top 20 locations, both in terms of number of time called and then officer effort expended there. The good news around now we're approaching a year in terms of neighbourhood policing return and the turn of the year for the investment. At the last round of QPRs, which was a fortnight ago, for the top 10 across all 4 districts, so the top 40 demand locations for the force, had seen a quarter-on-quarter reduction in 35 of those. The 5 that weren't, 4 of those were the hospitals. So we now get a real clear understanding, and as you can see on page 2 of this report, we can look at the officer hours. So this is the officer effort expended if we were to look at hospitals alone. So we can see for the force that's 2,140 hours. So that's 267 full officer working days that we commit to the hospitals. And we might actually say that that's the tip of the iceberg, because the 2,140 hours are actually the hours that we can draw from our systems, our command and control systems, so we can attribute an accurate figure to that. What is lost behind that would be time spent submitting crime reports, investigating, actually outside of the command log, the time spent searching for individuals. So we've now got greater insight into the hours used, but in actual fact that figure might increase 4-fold in terms of the actual officer time. So we get ever more a greater understanding around where our demand lies. So I can see where it lies around retail premises, which fast food areas, for example McDonald's is a huge demand draw on us. Officers don't spend very long there, but they are repeatedly called to low-level ASB, so we look for solutions around problem solving, which on occasions has seen something as simple as turn off the Wi-Fi, stops being a youth club for many young people who are going there, and that brings the solution.
Just on the hospital demand reduction group, on that, can you say just a brief word around that? I mean, in what ways do you reduce demand when talking to the hospital? Sarah mentioned this in her...
Indeed, and shame Sarah's gone because there was some plaudits for Barnsley. Barnsley have got, when I look at the 12-month profile for Barnsley, who've been doing this longer than the other districts, they've actually seen the demand from the hospital reduced by 50%. 50%? 50% through, so it's still high.
But that's extraordinary.
And that's been around the problem-solving linkage, and Scott Green has got an excellent executive level, and if you just look at in terms of once we've raised and the understanding of our demand around the number of people who attend are extremely vulnerable and then leave, our responsibilities under Article 2, but also the hospitals, that's seen a change where there's now 15 members of security staff who work at Barnsley Hospital. You contrast that with other hospitals, sometimes it's 1, 2. So they have redoubled their efforts and more around how they manage their facilities. We've done joint training around vulnerability, what we would see in terms of people who are in crisis and likely to leave and become missing, and that is then an enormous effort that we require. So it's around identifying what our demand is, how we can jointly begin to work around minimising that, and also sharing the responsibility of you can't just pick the phone up to South Yorkshire Police and think that you've discharged your responsibilities around Article 2.
It can't be there's an urgent concern for someone's welfare, wants to walk out of the hospital, having had them sat in a waiting room for 6 hours.
Yeah.
It's either urgent or it's not,
yeah.
and it doesn't become urgent when it becomes our problem.
Yeah.
So the route forward now, we've got a forced demand reduction group, such as the challenge around hospitals. I've formed a hospital demand reduction group to be chaired by Superintendent Dan Thorpe. And this is really to bring the experience at Barnsley. Dan is doing some tremendous work across at Doncaster to bring that across all 4 districts, and the first meeting is convened for the 6th of October formally to take that forward. Much work is already underway, but that's the first time that group will come together. When we talk around the insight it gives us, where we can now see individual organisations and the demand it's placing on us, a very recent example that's not in the report, was this gave us a view that we had demand, certainly at Doncaster, flowing from travel lodges, which was unusual. A travel lodge would normally not feature in terms of demand. We would occasionally get called to a travel lodge. And this is what highlighted the relationship with Peterborough, and actually where vulnerable people were being sent into travel lodges as a policy approach, and that had significant implications for demand around the call for service as travel lodge encountered that vulnerability both within their premises and outside. So we've now got a great opportunity where before that would have been masked and it would have taken us some time to get to that. That's given us a very early opportunity to raise it with Peterborough and with our local authority members to seek an early solution.
But just to frame that issue, Peterborough Council were dealing with people with homelessness issues and in many cases mental health issues. We were buying them a train ticket and saying we booked your hotel in South Yorkshire Travel Lodge. There was no communication with the local authority, there was no communication with us, and as Dave says, it was actually because of the approach we take that we became aware of issues in one particular travel lodge. We raised it with the local authority, who equally had not been briefed by Peterborough, and we've now started engaging to try and resolve the problem, because it's not fair on the vulnerable person who's frankly given a train ticket and pointed north. That's not appropriate care. It's not fair on the people working in the travel lodge who on many occasions have to deal with people in mental health crisis. It's not fair on the other residents of the travel lodge, and it's not fair on our staff who turn up blind to try and deal with it. So by understanding the issues, we're now addressing that. We've addressed it, as you can imagine, direct with Peterborough, we've addressed it directly with Travel Lodge, we've got great support from local authorities, and we've flagged it up to central government. So by getting visibility on these sort of issues, we can start tackling them.
It's quite scandalous, really, that what you've described. But I presume Peterborough is not alone. I mean, we encountered it here with Travel Lodge in Peterborough, but I assume other councils are doing similar things.
Well, not as far as who are aware
not
with our
in South
council.
Yorkshire, but
we've raised that and we're satisfied. On Clydesdale thus far, that's not an issue for us. But as part of the scanning, obviously we flagged it initially in Doncaster. We then did our checks with the other districts to identify similar issues of it. So it is something that we now are aware of. It's a stunt that's out there, so we'll be looking at it for other places.
So, Commissioner, in terms of our understanding of demand and the ability for us to manage our resources, it is more advanced than I've ever seen before, and this is one area where I would suggest, as we strive to be outstanding, this is an area that we are perhaps leading nationally. Coming to page 3, satisfaction 90 is very much a focus around post-service satisfaction. So this is not perception-based, this is for victims who've suffered some form of crime and have had a service from us. Our aspiration is to reach an overall satisfaction level of 90%. We've still got some way to go. We've got a new dashboard around the satisfaction levels, which again gives us all the management information that we would need. We can now see the difference and differential that we didn't understand before around the difference between attended and non-attended crimes, and we can see there is quite a drop for non-attended crimes. So we're currently working as part of the 12-week delivery plan that closes in October to fully understand and action that. We've got monthly refreshing data. The force remains stable from July. I can see that from the early actions we've put in place, Sheffield is delivering some exceptional results, which we need to understand in terms of that element around best practice. And we've seen Rotherham, which we don't fully understand at the moment, see a bizarre crash in satisfaction levels within the month of July, which Steve Chapman, as the force leader who happens to be at Rotherham, is currently working hard to understand. But overall, we're heading in the right direction. We've got many actions that are going to be delivered by October.
Is there much direct engagement with the victims around this? I don't know how you how do you contact them?
Yes, I mean, this is around, there is a survey afterwards where they're asked to talk around their journey throughout. The initiatives that's under the 12-week delivery plan now, the new elements are we're now having victim panels at each of the districts. So actually, that's people who had a service, people who are still receiving a service midway through. So this is to help us understand the structures and policies we put in place that we think are serving our victims well. We really need to challenge ourselves to find out, you know, the truth of that experience so we can fix it as best we can with the resources we have. We have interventions each week. We have crimes allocated randomly to us in command team, or we make reality checks to speak with victims directly. Each of the district command teams are now doing that. And this is to make sure that our staff are aware that this is vitally important, that the quality we give them, that compassion, that being bothered to care around picking the phone up to victims regularly, even if we have no good news, is simply allowing that regular context. The one area you know, that's been a continual challenge is follow-up. We're often seen as the attendance highly professional, the officer attitude highly professional. These are 90% plus. You know, the advice and action taken at the scene 90% plus. Where we drop off a cliff is after that first contact, it then goes to follow-up, that we become inconsistent. Some people receive calls, but the majority don't get consistent updates, and that's where our focus lies. And the challenge, as I said, non-attended, they're not getting that level of service in the first instance. So we're challenging ourselves now with the Crime Support Hub as to how do we enhance that service, where for all the right reasons we've decided an incident and a crime doesn't warrant an attendance, but how do we get the quality in terms of follow-up for that? So I think there's about 42 actions that are in place for the 12-week delivery plan to get this embedded absolutely by October. So I would hope that really by Q3 into Q4, because that's the survey lag for these are after the crime is closed, that I would like to think that by the turn of the year, my thoughts are that we should start pushing towards that 90%. That there is about a 6-week lag in the surveying period. Offender management, equally an area where we've got, we've seen some real increase in the challenges around that. The cohorts within offender management is domestic abuse, CSE, serious acquisitive crime, all the forms within there, and serious and organised criminality. So the core cohorts had increased in size. They were managed by the local offender management panels and the MAPA processes locally. Again, the developments that really enhanced our ability to effectively manage this broad scale of offending cohort is the reintroduction of neighbourhood teams, where we're now beginning to separate and prioritise all of those offenders within there. The debt mentioned earlier, the very latest in terms of prioritisation around suspect management and harm from Sheffield, which is now being rolled out to the rest of the force. This is really going to give us the ability to understand within each of those categories. We can do on a daily basis a refreshed hierarchical search on each of those to put them in priority order, so we can then put those across the core dedicated IOM team, but also across our neighbourhood teams, so we're going to the right people and not getting swamped by the volume there. So some really encouraging signs within. Commissioner, what follows there really is a series of case studies. I don't intend to go through those. Some really good news with each of them, worthy of a read. The dismantling of the PSB, 77 motorbikes seized by our new off-road motorbike team, and really that gives the breadth of how understanding the demand, how the problem solving and the partnership work can bring together really to get the right results. So overall, a positive piece, Commissioner.
Just on page 37, the domestic abuse. You talked the other day about the app, the Bright Sky app. I wonder if you could just say a word around that, Chief. This was you, I think. Mentioned.
Yes, it was a piece of development which is designed to assist our officers in, at the point of interacting with the victim of domestic abuse, they can immediately facilitate and work with them to be able to access support, advice, be able to signpost them to other services, and to be able to facilitate that for them, and to use an app basically as the facility to assist.
And that was designed here,
indeed.
In conjunction with Wanted, Natalie.
That's right.
It's done a lot of work, it's national leading effect, so it might be a good one to come back if we give you a brief first.
Yeah,
and then we can.
I think. Yeah,
absolutely. So it's a really good piece of work.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for the report, and thank you for the case studies, because I think that does bring things to light and raise lots of.
If I just briefly make the point, because I think it's been touched on in Barnsley, and this report, if you like, gives the broader context to it. But when we're talking about the force becoming more proactive, more problem solving, so as to understand, get on top of demand. Some of that can sound almost like a bit of an academic wish-for type thing, but actually this is where it's starting to become tangible. So we have the top 40 demand locations not previously understood, hence HMIC's criticism about the force's inability to understand at the outset, let alone cope with the demand. With 35 of those 40 top locations seeing the reduction, and then as Dave has talked out, those stubborn remainers, if you like, then get worked on in increased detail. That then starts to make problem solving tangible in terms of what it means, because it allows us to invest in better outcomes, it allows us to invest in better quality of care, it allows us, as has happened in Barnsley, to actually create more neighbourhood officers, because you're starting to take from the old response block and adding. So essentially this starts to give the proof to the concept, which is over time we expect to see fewer of our people chasing their tails in ever decreasing circles, and more people preventing stuff from happening in the first place and nutting into those recurrent issues of demand which can and should be better managed. And that is, I think, the nub of this paper. And so it starts to make tangible the things that we've been talking about, almost as the planning assumptions that have underpinned some of those structural reforms that have been put in place.
I thought the case studies too illustrated very well that one of the priorities in the police and crime plan is protection of vulnerable people. Yeah. The definitions of vulnerability that come out of just reading those case studies, it's quite broad and it's quite extraordinary. Yeah. On the final page, page 38 or 8 on the document, there's a note there about volunteers. Could you just expand on that a little bit, about the use of cadets, both fire and rescue, as well as police and other volunteers?
Yeah, and again, a real good news area around sort of our coordination of volunteers and the strength of the partnership with the fire service. We have 80 cadets that are shared across our 4 districts. That's a stable number and actually increasing. And via our team there, that their use around test purchase operations, around engagement. They certainly feature for all the district engagement plans now. And indeed, you know, we use them at set piece events like fairs and you know, public events. But also where we're seeing high crime, we use the cadets to go out and to share crime prevention messages and very much become part of the team. We lead the way in terms of the use of cadets as well. We're now going to become the organisers for an inter-service cadets, so with the Army cadets, the Air Force, almost an inter-services linked with fire as well, around sort of team building, leadership skills. We're now organising that for the coming year, and we're going to become the focal point of that inter-cadet activity as well. So very strong around you know, volunteers and cadets.
Yes, I come across, get invited to meet all cadets across all the armed forces and the sea cadets, and yeah, that's good.
And just on the cadets issue, so visiting with the neighbourhood policing team at Headqaurters recently, they're making the running in introducing the so-called mini police scheme as well.
Oh, we wonder what has happened to that.
Which is that's where it'll start, and we'll start to work it forward. And basically, the mini police, these are youngsters drawn from primary schools who, for a fairly modest investment in a little bit of kit and what have you, it's a brilliant scheme. Sort of started up in County Durham, and you know, it's just engages youngsters in a really positive way, and I have great hopes for that. We've obviously aspired to do it, but it's not as yet got off the blocks, but it will. From the neighbourhood policing team, and Headqaurters will be the first start to that, and we'll see how it grows, and we can again report back to this on that going forward. But I think it'd be a good.
We have some volunteers in Royston, because I went out with the local primary school there with a speed gun, and they enjoyed being in their high visibility jackets and seeing people hauled in for for speeding. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions or comments? Thank you, David. So that was Force Performance Update on item 13. PCC Strategic Financial Planning, 14 Strategic Planning. This is a verbal report. Erica?
Chief, Commissioner, I made reference to this earlier on when we looked at the work programme to say that it's our intention to bring updates into this public arena following our planning and efficiency group. I got a verbal update, but I've also provided an overview that can be shared with the rest of the board once the Chiefs had an opportunity to have a look through this. The meeting only took place last Thursday afternoon, so it is probably not appropriate to share the narrative immediately. Is there anything, Chief, you want to highlight at this point?
No, and I'm just scanning the sort of the narrative, if you like, that stems from that, and again, I think it's accurate in the sense that I think we're confirming that we're pretty much in sync with the planning process. There are a number of important products to be brought forward over the coming months, all of which is sort of specified within the planning cycle, of course. And I'm confident that we'll be in a good position this year for us as we go forward into encapsulating that which needs to be signed off before the next policing round. That we're in a good place.
Okay. So the intention would be just to make any final amendments to this paper, and then we'll put that on the website with the rest of the pack.
Thank you. So shall we move then to JIAC, item 15. Melvin, glad you're not stuck on the motorway.
No, well, I got off at Thorpe Esley and sort of wheeled my way around, because I'd still been there, I think, otherwise. Thanks, Alan. We last met on the 24th of July, and it was very much a sort of tidy up on the final accounts, but obviously quite a number of other reports that we went through. One of the first ones was the fact that the OPCC have been revising their approach to its risk management arrangements, which we found sort of different, I suppose, and we're looking for a little bit more assurance on this new approach, which I think some of that will be coming to the September meeting. We also welcomed an update from DCC Roberts on the Forces process for progress in internal audit, external audit, and HMIC FRS actions and recommendations, which provided assurance to us that progress continues to be made against the particular risks identified, and the fact that we're actually on top of dealing with all these actions and recommendations. As Michael mentioned earlier, further amendments were required following discussion with the external auditors, KPMG, to finalise the statement of accounts. I did actually have a telephone conversation with both Rash and Michael before the meeting, so I was alerted to the recommendations, and members were quite happy to go along with those.
So KPMG, they've now gone?
Yes, they have, yeah. Yeah, yes. Grant Thornton will be at the September. They're not quite finished now, but Grant Thornton will actually be at the September audit committee.
But they've signed off. There's nothing. What more is there?
We've still not got the formal.
We're waiting for their finals.
We still haven't at their end.
He sent me an email towards the end of last week to say that he'd give me a call today.
Okay, so we're nearly there.
Yeah. Nearly there, yeah.
Yeah, so everything seems to have been fine in the end. And we again congratulated both the OPCC and Force for producing the statement of accounts in advance of the new shorter deadline, which seemed to go very well, given that you'd done that really well the previous year as well. We also received the annual Treasury Management Review Report for 2016-17, which provided assurance that all aspects of Treasury Management have been monitored appropriately. And again, we thank the OPCC for producing a much cleaner and simpler document, which I think, is that what you've been working on, Sarah?
What, sorry?
Treasury
we're just saying it's the annual Treasury Management Review for 17-18, not 16-17.
Yeah, I thought that too.
Yeah.
But it was certainly a much simpler document to read. We also refer back to the action around the inconsistency between the Head of Internal Audit's opinion and the Force's annual governance statement. And we agreed that by deleting one particular sentence in the Head of Internal Audit's opinion, which was detracting from the overall positive message in the Force's AGS, that made things much clearer.
I'm sure this is how Brexit will finally be solved. Deleting
a few sentences, yeah. Luckily it was only one. And then the final issue, we're a little concerned around the impact of the savings that have been proposed by the Force, and just requested assurance that
is that the current? We're talking about
the current savings, just some sort of impact assessment.
Which financial year are we talking about? The one we're in.
The ones we're in now, yes, yeah. Just to be assured that the savings that are being made not having a sort of adverse impact on something that we hadn't thought about really. And that's it.
Okay, thank you. Any questions or comments? Thank you very much, Margaret. Item 16 then, cybercrime. Tim, this is you again, I'm afraid. 42 to 48.
Okay. I'll try and talk around the report a little bit, if I may. Cybercrime, without a doubt, is probably the most fast-stirring development of law enforcement that's been experienced locally, regionally, nationally and internationally at the moment, and South Yorkshire Police, our regional colleagues, the National Crime Agency and all other forces in the country are continuing to develop their response to cybercrime, and trying to develop our understanding of what the impact is at a local, regional and national level. I think it's important probably just to set out a couple of definitions to start with, because cybercrime falls into two different kinds really. By far and away, the overwhelming majority of crime that has the label cyber attached to it is cyber-enabled crime, and that's where it is a conventional crime. This is simply enabled by the use of the digital space, such as a fraud, for example, where someone would have rang you up before and said, give us your bank details, or rang you up and duped you into some sort of fraud. The overwhelming majority of that is done online now. A smaller part of cybercrime, but one that has the potential for huge impact is cyber-dependent crime, and that is where the crime couldn't take place if it wasn't for the internet. So that would be your dedicated denial of service, malware type attack, such as the WannaCry one that we saw last year that affected significant swathes of the NHS. That's far smaller in terms of the volume of offences, but perhaps far more widespread in terms of its impact. What both have in common though is that they are significantly underreported. And if I deal with cyber-enabled first and why that's significantly underreported, very often people don't realise they've been a victim of crime. Very often people are a victim of an attempted cyber-enabled crime and just brush it off, and I have to put myself in that category because I, like most of us, get an email at some stage you think, that's not right, I'm not responding to it, stick it in my
they the ones I send you.
And you stick it in your deleted box and ignore it.
Spam, I think.
Ignore it. I'm just going to carry on. First day back from holiday, you say. It's all part of the conditioning process to get me back into work. But with cyber-dependent crime, often, particularly with businesses, the fact that they have been the subject of a cyber attack is not in their interest that that's publicised for a whole variety of reasons. That is going to change through GDPR now, that there's an obligation on businesses to report if they've been a victim of a malware attack or some sort of cyber-dependent crime. So we should see an uplift in reporting in relation to that over the coming months and years. So two different types, both significantly underreported. In terms of the national strategy, that's set out in the National Cyber Security Strategy, that's 2016 to 2021. There's a focus on three areas: defend, deter and develop. Before I get on to that, it's probably just worth just noting the volume of online crimes that we had. We had 2,600 between 16 and 17. We had 3,700 between 17 and 18. That represents in excess of a 40% increase in reported crime. Whilst that's a significant increase, my assessment of that is that we are only scratching the surface in terms of the real picture of cybercrime across the county. Anyway, I'll just moving forward in terms of the national strategy. The lead institution and the lead authority around cyber security is the National Cyber Security Centre. Now, it's that unit that has the job of protecting our critical infrastructure, our national critical infrastructure from cyber attacks, and that unit leads the response to major incidents and looks to improve the security of the internet on a global scale, working with international partners across the world. At a UK level, the principal enforcement agency that works with the NCSC is the National Crime Agency, that have the lead dealing with major attacks, such as the malware attack we saw in the NHS last year. Through the NCA and the Strategic Cyber Industry Group, there's a cyber assessment that is produced, and sitting alongside that, the MPCC have now developed a digital investigation self-assessment toolkit for forces to work with. We've started to work with that, and that's what shaped our local response, and indeed is shaping the regional response. If I start first at the region, the North East Transformation Innovation Collaboration programme has undertaken a regional pilot to try and standardise a regional response to cyber-dependent crime. It's fair to say across all the forces in the North East region this varies, and what is also clear is that when you have particularly a cyber-dependent crime, it is very, very rare that it's contained within force boundaries. Invariably it stretches across regional boundaries and national boundaries. So the lead response unit to that is the regional cybercrime team that's based within the ROCU up at Ridings House in Wakefield. and that's the principal vehicle through which we manage the local response to any cyber-dependent crime. We're currently working through the programme with various national funding schemes that's bringing in funding to actually enhance our capability with that, both in terms of personnel and equipment necessary to deal with this sort of crime. At a force level, we've been really clear that you simply cannot enforce your way out of this issue, and the key to developing our capability is about prevention and protecting people going forward. We have developed, as part of the crime review, a dedicated cybercrime team that consists of 1 detective sergeant, 3 detective constables, 4 digital media investigators, and most importantly, 1 cyber protect officer. And I'll talk a little bit more about that role in a minute. But we've now created that. We've got the budget behind that team as a result of the crime review. We've also had the job in relation to our digital media investigation capacity to try and expand that and expand it significantly and try and make it as future-proof as possible. That's very, very difficult with the sheer volume and potentially the sheer volume out there in terms of the number of devices that we have to investigate to effectively investigate this sort of crime. So we've introduced kiosks across the force now. We have over 200 officers that are trained in using what we call a kiosk. In essence, it's a bit like a converted laptop where you can stick a mobile phone, and it's used principally for mobile phones, and get a full digital download from that mobile phone that will suffice for the investigation of the majority of offences. That's created significant capacity within our digital investigations units that will allow us then to concentrate the resources that sit within that unit on the more complicated cyber investigations, where we've got to do extensive investigations into multiple different computers, potentially damaged computers, and investigate various parts of hard drives that people may choose to hide stuff that relates to offending. So we've created capacity in terms of digital media investigation. We've created capacity in terms of specialist personnel to manage this.
I don't know how you measure this or whether you can, but of the totality of crime, what percentage would fall under your definition of cybercrime then? I mean, and it's a growing percentage.
So if you look at the last year, we had 3,782 crimes that fell within, that had a cyber label to them, and that was out of 142,000 crimes. I suspect that's really important.
And that's growing.
Yeah.
I suppose a member of the public might say, well, is this all you've got then in terms of capability? 3.16. Shouldn't that be bigger, would be the reaction?
Well, I think where we're going with this in the long run is that a cyber-enabled crime, so someone's come along and they have committed an harassment via Facebook, or they have committed a fraud using online capability. Where I envisage law enforcement going is that in years to come, that will be a standard crime that will be investigated just like a shoplifting was when I was
so not a specialist role.
There's no getting away from it. And the skills, you know, we've started now training 200 officers to download and understand and interpret what a mobile phone download looks like. You know, the ambition would be that number will increase year on year. The ability to be able to look at an online crime scene and manage it and investigate it is like sticking a piece of tape around a physical crime scene was when we all joined the police, you know, only a few years ago. So I don't think creating a bigger and bigger specialist team is ever going to to meet the sort of demand that we're going to have to meet in the future. I think that we need to create a lead team that can investigate the more complicated offences. Where we've got to go in the future is look at our whole training provision around probationers and our whole PIP 1 being our sort of volume crime capability, to make sure that every police officer has the skills to be able to investigate basic cybercrime, and that there's the infrastructure that exists locally to be able to facilitate that, principally the ability to download digital material. We're continuing to work our way through this self-assessment tool to really shape what our capability will need to look like in the future. But I would return to the role of protect. You simply cannot enforce your way out of this. That is impossible. So often, the offenders that are, you can be committing a cyber-enabled crime, and you could be sat on a laptop in a kitchen in the Ukraine doing it. That is the reality of what we're dealing with here. So making people far better aware of cyber security and looking after their own cyber interests is absolutely critical to this. That features in our communications campaign, but the work that we're undertaking with Operation Signature alongside Action Fraud is our current I suppose principal operation to deal with that. So we get referrals in for Action Fraud. All these crimes, or the overwhelming majority of them, are not reported to us, they're reported to Action Fraud, which is the central repository for recording all fraud offences, the majority of which are cyber enabled. We get notifications in of all those crimes that have taken place. We run those through a matrix to identify which of those victims are potentially vulnerable, whether it by way of age or other vulnerability. That narrows it down to a smaller number. We then, through our neighbourhood policing teams, go out and complete a questionnaire with them to truly establish their vulnerability, and that allows us then to put together a bespoke crime prevention package for those victims to try and prevent them becoming a victim again. The Protect officer, which has been included in the crime review, will be the single point of contact for that, for coordinating protective prevention activity around cyber-enabled fraud across the county.
I go to quite a few community groups, but also groups of older people in communities. Do we have any literature, anything that we can give?
We do. Yeah.
That would be really good. We must get onto that. Fiona.
But the principal issue around this, there are a lot of very basic security people can do that they don't, and it's about not having the same password for everything. It's about keeping control of your password. It's about understanding when you get a phishing email in, what does it look like, and it's about never giving anyone your details online. All the basic things that people can do to prevent themselves becoming a victim. Knowledge of that is not as widespread as it could be. I think there's definitely a difference across generations.
I currently have 27 passwords.
That's very good.
Four of them are here, related to just communicating with yourselves.
That's very good. Very good. I managed to struggle to remember mine this morning, even after 2.5 weeks off. But that is one of the principal challenges that we have. Far too often, people have the same password for every different credit card, every bank account, their Facebook, and then it only takes one to be breached, and then there's a potential.
I didn't say they were 27 different. No, they are, but it's a nightmare to remember it. So it's a hard world we're taking people into.
So that's the pitch that we are at the moment. What I'd say to you is, I'd probably welcome the opportunity to bring this back, at a point in the future, maybe in 9 or 12 months' time, because it is a really developing area.
I'm sure that's right, and it's one of those issues that clearly isn't going to go away and is going to grow. So
it's not.
Absolutely. Just a question on Action Fraud. can't remember who told me that if something's reported to action, it takes 7 weeks before it gets back to SYP. Can that be true?
They do come in blocks. They do come in blocks back. Right. So what Action Fraud does, it's a single repository that will look at, they'll pull together all the offences, because it may well be, so if we have a victim here, there's a victim in Merseyside, there's a victim in Northumbria, and there's a victim in Chester, but the suspect is in Suffolk, probably the most appropriate force to deal with that is Suffolk Police. Right. So the investigation we pass to Suffolk Police to identify offender and prosecute.
So what contact would there be then with the victim in South Yorkshire?
There's two of them. There's an element of the investigator. The investigation team will contact the victim to actually conduct the investigation. But the referrals that come back, when I talk about the block of referrals, I think I'm not sure it's 7 weeks. I think it's monthly. The return comes back to us. When we get that return back of victims, so we will have a block of victims here who we might not necessarily have a crime recorded for initially, because the crime will be recorded at Action Fraud. What we do then is use our matrix to identify which of those victims are vulnerable, which will require further attention to prevent them becoming a victim again. And that's what Operation Signature is.
Right. If it's monthly, that's the 7 weeks probably. If you miss your monthly, you're into the next. Yeah.
Action Fraud, if there was an immediate apparent vulnerability, we'll flag it earlier.
Yeah, we do. You've got to many of those. Many of those victims would be people like me, for example, who just have reported the fact that someone's tried to, or even reported to me bank that someone's tried to have a got my account.
Okay. And just on the point of prevention, and there's a tremendous amount of work going on at the moment just to try and systemize this across the board, because there are so many things now, custom and practice. Finance directors in a company goes on holiday and gives all the information, the out of office reply as to who the direct reports are, who to speak to instead, and then people simply hack into that, purport to be the finance director, ordering a cost accountant to transfer monies between one account and another. It's so simple, and so there is so much that people can do to protect themselves. But like you say, it's a complicated world, and it's just almost holding that up to scrutiny to people to try and say, actually, if you control the sort of information that you hold in your personal detail, your chances of being victimised reduce almost to nothing. But if you don't, you never know, and that's the big problem with it.
Well, the fraudsters work on percentages, don't they? They'll hit so many thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. And the public needs to be aware about the nature of these people, because they have mug lists, which is what they refer to people who will give them details. So people who become a victim of crime are more likely to be another victim of crime, because they'll appear on a mug list, which gets circulated amongst these sort of people.
Yeah. But I was surprised, sort of 18 months, 2 years ago, I went to a meeting of small business people in South Yorkshire, the number of people who were running small firms who were saying, oh no, I'm not sure I've done quite simple and quite basic things, and it scares me, and I don't want to know, and I leave it all to the finance director or whatever it might be, and I think that's a real issue too.
It's huge.
Alan, could I just to go back to action fraud, is it still police advice to refer any suspected cybercrime through Action Fraud, or is it now possible to refer to your local police force? Because that was an issue about 2 or 3 years ago, and I tried to do that myself, and a very unsatisfactory response from Action Fraud. I remember.
You can report either direct to Action Fraud. If you ring up and there's a call for service and there's an incident taking place now, of course we'll attend. But we have to, if we report here, we have to then get an Action Fraud reference number and it gets sent down to them. So it all ties together.
Because there is a general fee, and this is something that applies to central government as well, as I know from wearing another hat. That there is a general fee you have to go through Action Fraud in order to get out to a police force who will then investigate. So if that isn't any longer the case,
the purpose of Action Fraud is to be the national hub for this. So let's not send any messages that deviate from that. Clearly, if there is a pressing need or someone's vulnerable, then of course as with any crime, but the appropriate mechanism is through action fraud. That's what it's there for.
Because action fraud, the important thing is you know, it comes back to this nature of that you have an offender in one part of the country and you might have multiple victims all over the place, and the whole purpose of action fraud is to draw that together and make sure the most appropriate law enforcement agency deals with that crime. You know, and there is a constant two-way dialogue in terms of information coming back from action fraud to us, and if we do report something here, you know, we go out because a victim's vulnerable or it's a crime that's happening now, it's really important, and it's something that we've tightened up on, is that we then send that to action fraud, because if we just retain it here, well, the chances, you know, particularly if the suspects in Suffolk or somewhere else or Ukraine.
We probably ought to put on record that not all criminality goes back to Suffolk.
No.
Or the Ukraine.
No.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. It's obviously something that we will return to. Were there any other questions or comments? Or happy with that? Thank you, Tim. Is there any other business? In which case, that's the whole of the business. Thank you very much, everyone, and welcome back after the bank holiday. Thank you, Tim.